In game discussions, you'll often hear people talk about crowd control in a general sense, but you'll almost never hear them explain what exactly it means in detail. The concept is elusive and unclear. Almost all games have crowd control in some sense. On top of that, the same types of mechanics can lead to vastly different styles of crowd control, so I thought it would be useful to share my personal definition and explain why I use it.
An overview.
So what is crowd control in the broadest possible sense? I think it's basically three things. Number one, the player's ability to shut down the enemy's movement and attack states for a time. So think about like hitstun, knockdowns, dizzy states, juggles. Number two, the player's ability to control the enemy's positioning. So, kiting them, luring them, pushing, pulling them, and throws, and like beat 'em up throws. And number three, the player's ability to capitalize on both these things. So being able to hit groups, like ground attacks, environmental stuff, or ring outs. Then once all of this is a factor, the extent to which the player can do all this shit defines how strong the crowd control tools are. However,
crowd control has to be contested.
Having strong crowd control tools isn't enough. A tool without problems to solve will just be a toy. For a game to have meaningful crowd control, your ability to manage enemies has to be tested by the game's challenges and rewarded if you pull everything off correctly. So crowd control based gameplay means that the game has all the tools and tests your usage of those tools properly. You can think about sandbox games which use mechanics as toys, like Breath of the Wild, where you can group enemies together, but there's a lot of other options you can do, like sniping them from a distance. Technically the options are there, but they're not properly tested or rewarded relative to other options.
Crowd control has to be accessible.
Crowd control is too situational. Like if it's tied to resources or fucking meter or cooldowns, then even if the tools are there, they're de-emphasized since your access isn't guaranteed. So as amazing as something like Resident Evil 4's grenades are for crushing groups, or the matches in The Evil Within, I think they lose points by being so strictly limited. This is a spectrum though. The more limited they are, the less crowd control based a game becomes, in my opinion.
Styles of crowd control.
There are two big styles of crowd control, which is group and crush and divide and conquer. Group and crush is all about affecting enemy position. It's about getting enemies into one nice big clump and then putting that clump in the blender, or exploding it. Divide and conquer is all about getting single enemies away from the back and then bullying the shit out of them. Both are valid ways of defining crowd control. However, I tend to stress group and crush because it gives the player more control. With divide and conquer, you have to rely on the whims of enemy AI, enemy movement to make it work, and your victories tend to be isolated. So let's say you gained an advantage during combat. You isolate an enemy, you're like comboing it, you're killing it. That's a very self-contained little interaction. It's not going to be all that different than just deleting the enemy from existence. Whereas group and crush forces you to really think about how all the enemies fit together, so to speak, by letting one victory carrying over into the next, letting you set up chains of crowd control, like chain reactions. Think of it like this: if enemies are resources you can use against other enemies and to create chain reactions of crowd control, then just deleting an enemy from the group might actually make things harder because you lose access to crowd control tools, unlike in divide and conquer. So when I say something is more crowd control based, it'll always mean that it's more group and crush based, because I simply think that's a more interesting way of handling crowd control.
Levels of crowd control.
With all that shit out of the way, it's time to define the levels of crowd control. You can use them to determine how crowd control heavy a game is. Each subsequent level more or less includes all the stuff in the levels before it and introduces something extra. Though in practice they aren't quite as linear, because if you emphasize one thing, you de-emphasize another. If you have a lot of throws, then you'll de-emphasize the nuances of kiting enemies.
Level 0, sequence-based combat and randomized enemy movement.
This is either the bare minimum or no crowd control at all. Games like Kung Fu Master or Spartan have sequence-based combat where you can only engage one enemy at a time, so any kind of crowd control here will be incidental, and it's very rare. Something like Zelda 1 is also similar, despite not really having sequence-based combat, just because the enemies walk around randomly and your ability to affect their positioning is very, very limited.
Level 1, positioning-based crowd control.
This is stuff like Gauntlet and a ton of twin-stick shooters, where enemies react to your position in real time, usually by moving towards you. You can now do a bunch of stuff like kiting enemies, funneling them into hallways, or even using some basic divide and conquer strats by baiting them away from the pack. This is the most primitive type of crowd control there is.
Level 2, Hitstun, knockdowns and wide hitboxes.
Games like Slashout have this sort of crowd control as the basis of their gameplay, but for a more relatable example, imagine a Dark Souls playstyle where you only use the basic movement, rolling, and attacks. Now you'd have a perfect representation of this level of crowd control. You can do all the level 1 stuff like kiting enemies and luring them away from groups, and on top of that you can also deactivate them for a brief period of time, and hit multiple targets with a single attack. This level really starts rewarding successful crowd control as well, because if you have multiple dudes clumped together, you can hit them all in one attack.
Level 3. Invincibility frames and area of effect.
Area of effect attacks allow you to truly and safely punish clumped up enemies, while contextual finishers with invincibility frames add a resource aspect. Enemies are no longer just threats, they're now beneficial and can be used defensively. Dark Souls is kinda like this if you use AoE spells and aggressively go for backstabs, for example. Something like Diablo lives somewhere between level 2 and level 3. It doesn't have iframe finishers that use enemies, but it does have very strong AoEs and a bunch of like freeze, slowdown, stun states, and stuff like corpse explosions, which let you use enemies as resources.
Level 4. Throws and enemy bowling.
Now we come to stuff like Spikeout and God Hand. These games add throws or launchers, which let you control the position of not just single enemies, but also any enemies they hit. So basically, they'll let you control groups. A single enemy can now be your key to victory. The only thing that distinguishes this from 2D beat-em-ups is that divide and conquer tends to be the best strategy overall. Usually in games like this, you have like enemy model collisions that prevent effective grouping, or too much super armor or some kind of strong wake-up attacks. Something prevents you from grouping them as efficiently as you could.
Level 5. Clump and crush. Ground attacks.
Alright, and now at the end of the list you have 2D beat-em-ups, especially with the Final Fight variety, which have everything. This, in my opinion, is peak crowd control. You have enemies that track your position and move towards you, letting you kite and funnel them. You have all sorts of hit reaction states, lengthy hitstun, knockdowns, wall splats, dizzy states, and even more unique states that some games have, like for example Night Slashers. You have very fast attacks with wide hitboxes, so if you clump enemies up and want to hit them on wake up, you'll have no issues whatsoever, you'll just completely lock them down. You have throws with invincibility frames, which let you knock other enemies down and group them together. You even have ground stomps or ground shots or other mechanics that let you hit downed enemies. And in the best games of the genre like Final Fight and Streets Rage 2 on Mania, all this crowd control stuff is highly contested, you're always being challenged. That's pretty much my definition. So there's obviously a lot more complexity here, like for example the way the levels interact with how hard the crowd control is contested. You could make an argument that a lower level is more intensive, more crowd control intensive, just because the game challenges the player better, even though they don't have the tools. So there's a lot of leeway, but hopefully it'll give you the tools to think about a lot of the shit more clearly, instead of calling every fucking game with multiple enemies crowd control based. Jesus Christ. Also, wait! If you liked the video and you're one of the more rare species of literate gamers, then you can check out a lot of posts I did on the Patreon, more written posts where I talk about beat-em-up design. For example, this post about the pacing in beat-em-ups, and this one about the beauty of super joys. They're all free, you don't have to actually subscribe or anything, but I won't complain if you throw some money at me, so...